you're doing well. In this video, I'll explain the steps for creating a smooth walk animation for a sprite in as little as 5 frames. I'll explain the concept of keyframes, in-betweens, and also the key tools I recommend for helping you on your pixel art animation journey, as well as what I use. In this series over the coming months, we'll use this sprite as the basis for creating some very cool animation like you may have seen in games like Final Fight and Street Fighter. You also need to know that sprite animation takes time. I'll explain how to optimize the process, but the only way that it will become easier and quicker is by putting in the time to practice. Start simple. If you rush into buying equipment, different apps, and don't power through making mistakes, making notes of how to improve, and so forth, you'll only become more disillusioned because you'll assume that you just can't do it. The simple truth is that you can. Work hard and get some good advice. I hope the video fulfills the latter for you. So let's start. First up, I am using Aseprite for this video, but other tools that work well are available, such as Photoshop, or if you like retro systems like I do, Deluxe Paint is always good fun. This video will not explain how to use Aseprite's animation features per se, as I will cover that separately, but I will point out the general process so as to be as application agnostic as possible, as the key message of this video is how to draw a walk animation. I will not cover character design in this video because I want to cover that in a separate series of videos coming soon, but here you can see Saki-chan, the character that we'll be creating in pixels today. I initially drew Saki-chan with an inexpensive graphics tablet. The reason I use a graphics tablet is so I can be more expressive with movement. I will then usually switch to a mouse to put the detail in. The only way you'll find out what works for you is by practicing. Try with a mouse to start with, and if you don't have a graphics tablet already and you find it a bit stiff to work with, an inexpensive tablet might be a good thing to try. But put some hours in first on trying to design your character, just so that you can get a feel of things with just using a mouse first. On that note, there are no magic bullets equipment-wise, apart from practicing and continuously working to improve your skills. For example, this might not be an animated image, but it was drawn with a mouse on a 27-year-old Commodore Amiga 600 computer and Deluxe Paint. So don't immediately assume you can't do it because you don't have the latest and greatest Wacom Santi graphics tablet display. There are 3 animation phrases I want to explain first. The first is keyframes. These are the key points in your character or object's movement which you'll move towards. They are critical points in the animation that defines its overall action. Between these keyframes, you need in-between frames, generally to help smooth out the path of the animation towards its next keyframe. This process of creating in-betweens is called tweening. There is a bit more to these principles, but let's keep it simple to start with. For a minimal 5-frame walking animation, you need 3 keyframes, mid-stride pose, which will be in the middle of your animation at frame 3, and 2 full stretch keyframes for the legs and arms at opposing ends of the stride on frames 1 and 5. This can be summarised as shown on the screen. The overall position of the limbs in these keyframes will be as follows, as now shown on the screen. The only anomaly that you may not expect is the back leg in keyframe B. Why is it not straight? First, if it was, it would make the character look like it was moonwalking rather than walking, as one foot will always be off the ground mid-stride, alternating between the front and back leg. The second reason it's part illusion is the only way I can describe this when creating a minimal 5-frame walk animation. Technically speaking, the front leg should also have an additional keyframe in a walk animation of 8 unique frames, where the additional keyframe will have the front leg with its knee bent and the foot off the ground mid-stride. But we're cheating here by only lifting the back foot off the ground, and curiously, the illusion holds up. This worked well on systems with limited memory and storage, like we had in the 16-bit days. The number of in-between frames where you tween the animation is up to your discretion, but we will stick with a simple 1 in-between frame between keyframes. The more in-between frames you add, the smoother the animation cycle will be, but also your character may look less dynamic as a result. There is much more to an animation cycle than just making it smooth, so for example, you may need to bring your character to a stop and there are more animation frames to work through to get to a natural stop position, this may actually cause delays and lag in the controls. So there is a balance to strike between apparent smooth animation and apparent responsiveness. You can repeat frames 2 to 4 inclusive in a 5-frame walk animation, but reverse them to complete the walk cycle within 8 frames, but only having to draw the 5 frames, using the illusion previously described. More complex movements will need more keyframes, but the simple walk and running movements do not require more than this in my experience, unless there are quirks to your character's walking motion. For example, they may have a limp. My process for creating a 5-frame walk animation is as follows. Start with a 32 pixel wide sprite for your keyframe B mid-stride pose. This then gives you ample scope to build nice animations with weapons or other movement when you expand the sprite to containers at 64 pixels wide. I wanted in this tutorial to show a more detailed sprite than I have covered before, but I will in a future video show a more simple sprite animation of a more typical type that we found in the 16-bit era, such as you may have found in a JRPG like Chrono Trigger or a platform game like Super Mario World. I have created a somewhat taller sprite here because I want to use this as the basis for some more advanced animation, as we'll go on to like you'll see in a beat 'em up or a one-on-one fighter. First, I recommend drawing keyframe B, as this will define your character's basic pose. My recommendation after many years of experimentation, including refining my process even during the making of this video, is to create 5 layers as follows. Front arm, character, back arm, front leg and back leg. The front arm will be the top layer and the bottom layer will be the back leg. Define a character by only adding detail to the torso, hair and face on the character layer. Then draw the limbs on their respective layers using a single distinct colour for each. This is a halfway house between getting the general look settled and also not putting in too much detail that you'll only end up erasing. Save at this point. If you put the details onto the arms and legs at this stage, as I've inferred, you'll only have to erase all of that hard work when it comes to animating them. Next, I recommend you move to keyframe A as your next frame. Using Aseprite, you can simply create a new frame that duplicates the selected frame and erase the limbs from each respective layer on your new frame. I use onion skinning so that I can easily see the previous position and drawing the limbs in the position as defined by keyframe A's limb position in my initial diagram. I'll be honest, this is the part that needs practice to make sure the limbs retain the overall same proportion as keyframe B, but flipping back and forth between the 2 keyframes, you will train your eye as to when you have drawn it too big, too small, not moving enough, which results in stiff animation, which may suit some characters, or maybe moving it too much, which again creates an exaggerated animation, but this may suit some characters. Make sure you draw each limb on its respective layers and use the same respective colours as before for each limb. Now duplicate the process but for keyframe C. You should now have 3 keyframes of animation. Run the animation at around 100 milliseconds per frame or 3 to 4 frames per second. If you can play a ping pong style of playback rather than a loop, you'll avoid the snapping that occurs when looping from frame 3, keyframe C, back to frame 1, which is keyframe A. But even so, just concentrate on the forward motion and look where you can see the limbs grow or shrink, or where the limb differs too much in terms of position and movement when looking at keyframes A and C. Just use your eyes and gradually refine the limbs until the look is well proportioned across all frames and that the movement amount matches your character and the limbs are in positions suggested in the basic walk animation diagram as shown here. The animation will be choppy because we don't have the tween or the in-between frames between the keyframes. Sometimes this can be charming in itself, for example in the original Rockman or Mega Man games on the Famicom or NES. But you'll generally want to have a bit more refinement for your typical 16-bit style of game. Do not add any more detail to the torso yet, or indeed the limbs. Now we need to tween the animation by creating the in-between frames that will sit between the keyframes. The process is exactly the same as creating the keyframes, and the limbs will be moving towards their next keyframe. Otherwise, there is nothing special about in-between frames versus keyframes. They just smooth the animation out. Once you've created your in-between frames and are happy with the motion on previewing the animation and after refining, this is when you can start adding detail to each limb by recolouring and adding detail. I tend to focus on the overall colour first, frame by frame, and add the outline detail frame by frame, and then return to the other details, like gradually building up the shoe on each frame. In essence, I don't personally finish up one frame's limbs in total and all the details completely, and then move on to the next frame and do the same. I find I get much more consistent results by, for example with the shoes, drawing the sole of each shoe on each frame sequentially, and then go back to frame 1 and drawing the main body of the shoe on all frames sequentially, making sure that the size remains consistent through the animation. And then perhaps I return to frame 1 and add the details, and do this on each frame sequentially, and then finally I go back to frame 1 and sequentially add the anti-aliasing to each frame. You can certainly work on making one frame perfect at a time, but I find my consistency is personally much better by doing it sequentially, and leads to much less fatigue, especially when working on animations much longer than 5 frames. If you're happy with your animation, to check it is a good walk animation, you can copy frames 2, 3 and 4 and add them after frame 5. Reverse these copied frames and then run a loop animation on all frames, and set the frame rate to around about 125 milliseconds per frame, or about 12 frames per second, and you should have a very nice walking animation. If you find that this is a little fast, set it back to 100 milliseconds per frame, or about 10 frames per second. You will notice in my animation of Saki-chan that I've added some gentle movement to the hair to mimic air passing through, and I've only done this by changing a few pixels at a time, as I didn't want to over-exaggerate this. You will however notice that I have the shoulders and therefore the torso swinging as the front arm moves forward. This suited my character pose, but is not essential. I've also managed to mimic some of the movement by not moving the head up and down, by just slightly moving the head backwards and forwards as the torso moves. These details are not essential, but are something that you may grow to enjoy doing as your skills advance. Finally, I've just added the barest of details, such as a blue sky layer, a green ground layer, and a little bit of foliage to scroll by, so that we can see how the animation would look if this character was walking by some scenery. This way we can see that the animation looks lovely and natural. Anyway, that's a lot of information to take in. I've added lots of helpful resources to my Patreon page, including a slide deck. You may find this really helpful, and you can get access to this for as little as $2 per month. And I guess that all remains for me to say is see you soon. Peace! So it's come to that part of the video where I mention that I'm on Patreon. From as little as $2 a month you can get early access to content, exclusive artwork through the post, your name mentioned on videos, as well as tips that I don't publish to the public. You can find a link in the video description below. Your subscription to my channel will also help me ensure that I can bring the latest content here from Japan.